Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into the world of the library that whispered beneath the starlight. There was once a place where all the whispers of the ancient world gathered into one breath. A place where the dust of forgotten kingdoms settled upon scrolls that held the memory of stars. It stood at the edge of the sea, where the salt air carried the last syllables of languages no longer spoken, and where the light of the Mediterranean fell in long, golden ribbons across floors of polished stone. This was the great Library of Alexandria, not merely a building, not merely a collection of texts, but a living, breathing temple to the idea that knowledge itself was sacred, that understanding was not something to be owned, but something to be held gently, like a flame cupped between two hands in the darkness. And so we begin here, at the threshold of that vanished place, where the doors have long since crumbled, and the columns have long since turned to dust, but where something, some faint echo, some trembling resonance, still lingers in the silence between the waves. Close your eyes now. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day fall from your shoulders. Like a cloak you no longer need. We are going somewhere old, somewhere quiet, somewhere that exists now only in the space between memory and dream. And in that space, the library still stands. Its lamps still glow with a warm amber light. Its corridors still stretch into distances that no map has ever charted. And it's layered over whispers of 10,000 of 100,000 prebin, Leighton and Kfiwi zent Prespiwal, Estivial of Tiwa, Spares through the veil store sleeping future, while to the sleeping future. The city of Alexandria was itself a kind of dream. It was born from the vision of a conqueror who saw in the flat and sandy shore of the Egyptian coast something that no one else could see, a city that did not yet exist, shimmering like a mirage above the water. Alexander the Great, the young king of Macedon, stood on that shore in the year 331 before the Common Era, and he looked out across the harbour, and he imagined columns of white marble rising against the blue sky. He imagined gardens where scholars would walk beneath the shade of sycamore trees, speaking in quiet voices about the nature of the cosmos. He imagined a lighthouse, a great tower of fire and stone, that would guide ships from across the known world to this one luminous point on the map. He imagined a city that would be the meeting place of all civilizations, where Egyptian priests would sit beside Greek philosophers, where Persian astronomers would share their star charts with Babylonian mathematicians, where the wisdom of India might mingle with the poetry of Athens, and where the sacred texts of a dozen different traditions might rest side by side upon the same shelves, like old friends who had finally found their way home to one another. Alexander never saw his city completed. He died young, as the bright ones often do, in the distant city of Babylon, his body consumed by a fever that no physician could name and no remedy could cure. Some say he was poisoned. Some say the gods simply called him home. Some say that the weight of all those conquered kingdoms finally settled upon his heart and stilled it. But the dream of Alexandria, that did not die with him, it passed, like a sacred inheritance, into the hands of his general Ptolemy, who carried Alexander's body back to Egypt in a golden coffin and laid it to rest in the very city that bore his name. And it was Ptolemy the First, Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the Saviour, who understood that the truest way to honour Alexander's vision was not through conquest, but through collection. No, through the gathering of lands, but through the gathering of knowledge. And so he began to build. No, just a library. Something far greater. Something began to build a Mushintiudisatuanasti. Those Naidans Shronaides of Tigo Omai Hesides of core in the history of the world. The Maushan was to be their dwelling place on earth, a sanctuary where the human pursuit of understanding would be treated as an act of worship, where the scholar and the priest were one and the same, where the act of reading was indistinguishable from the act of prayer, And at the heart of the mountain, like a jewel set within a crown, was the library. Imagine it now. Imagine walking through the outer gardens of the mountain as the sun begins to set over the harbour of Alexandria. The air is warm and carries the scent of jasmine and papyrus. Fountains murmur softly in courtyards, where the light falls in patterns of gold and shadow. Colonnades stretch in long, graceful lines, their marble columns catching the last warmth of the day and holding it the way a grandmother holds the hand of a child. Gently, with infinite patience, with a tenderness that speaks of something far older than words, scholars move through these gardens in small groups, or alone, their robes trailing behind them like the tails of comets. Some carry scrolls tucked beneath their arms. Some carry nothing at all, their hands clasped behind their backs, their eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance, where a thought is slowly taking shape. They speak in many languages, Greek and Egyptian, Aramaic and Hebrew, Persian, and perhaps even tongues from lands so distant that their names have been lost to us entirely. And as you walk deeper into the complex, the world outside begins to fade. The sounds of the harbour, the creak of ship ropes, the cries of merchants, the clatter of carts on cobblestone. All of it grows softer, more distant, until it is no more than a memory. And in its place, a new sound emerges, a sound that is almost impossible to describe, but that, once heard, can never be forgotten. It is the sound of silence speaking. It is the sound of 10,000 scrolls resting in their alcoves, each one containing a voice that has been waiting, perhaps for decades, perhaps for centuries, to be heard again. It is the sound of ink that has dried on papyrus, but that still remembers the hand that wrote it, the breath that blew across it to speed the drying, the whispered word that accompanied each stroke of the reed pen. It is the sound of thought itself, preserved and patient, resting in the amber light of oil lamps that burn with a flame so steady it seems to exist outside of time. This is the library. This is the place where the ancient world kept its soul. The collection was vast beyond imagining. At its height, the great Library of Alexandria is said to have contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Some historians place the number even higher. But numbers alone cannot capture the true magnitude of what was gathered here. For these were not mere documents, not inventories or tax records or the mundane paperwork of empire, though such things were surely present as well. These were the thoughts of civilizations, the dreams of entire peoples, the accumulated wondering of generations who had looked up at the same stars we see tonight and asked the same questions we still ask in the darkness before sleep. There were the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, those two great rivers of Greek poetry that had shaped the imagination of an entire civilization, and not just one copy, but many copies, gathered from different cities and different centuries, each one slightly different from the others, each one carrying the fingerprints of its own particular journey through time. The scholars of Alexandria would lay these copies side by side and compare them, word by word, line by line, searching for the truest version of the text, the version closest to what Homer himself, that blind poet of the distant past, had actually sung in the firelight of some forgotten hall. There were the dialogues of Plato, those luminous conversations about the nature of justice and beauty and truth, in which the voice of Socrates, that strange, barefoot philosopher, who wandered the streets of Athens asking questions that no one could answer, still echoed with a clarity that made it seem as though he was standing in the room, smiling his gentle, ironic smile. Waiting for what you knew was not an answer at all, but merely the beginning of a deeper question, of a duetas of Aristobal Habinata, of Aristocles of Ansprus, a research supporter of Dassault of Portray, Aristophacabita, Aristotle, who had tried to hold the entire world within the framework of his mind, and had come closer than perhaps anyone before. His works filled shelf after shelf, scroll after scroll, and the scholars who studied them felt as though they were walking through a vast and intricate garden in which every path led to another path, and every flower opened to reveal another flower hidden within. There were the geometries of Euclid, who had worked in Alexandria itself, and whose elements, that crystalline chain of propositions and proofs, would remain the foundation of mathematical thinking for more than 2,000 years. There was something almost sacred about Euclid's work, something that transcended the merely mathematical. His proofs moved with the inevitability of a prayer, each step following the last with a logic so pure that it seemed to come not from the human mind, but from the structure of reality itself, as though Euclid had not invented his theorems, but merely discovered them, the way one discovers a hidden door in an ancient wall. There were the astronomical observations of Babylonian priests, recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script, documenting the movements of the planets across centuries of patient watching. These men had stood on the tops of ziggurats, those great stepped towers that rose above the flat plains of Mesopotamia like stairways to the sky, and they had tracked the wandering lights of the heavens with an accuracy that still astonishes modern astronomers. They knew the cycles of Venus. They could predict eclipses. They had mapped the constellations and given them names that we still use today, though the language in which those names were first spoken has been silent for millennia. There were Egyptian texts, papyri inscribed with hieroglyphs and hieratic script, containing medical knowledge, magical incantations, hymns to gods whose temples have long since fallen into ruin. The Egyptian tradition of writing was ancient beyond measure, older than Greece, older than Rome, older perhaps than any other literary tradition in the Western world, and within these texts lay secrets that the Egyptian priests guarded with a fierce and sacred jealousy, knowledge of embalming and the preservation of the dead, knowledge of the movements of the Nile and the timing of its floods, knowledge of architecture, of how to raise stones of impossible weight to impossible heights, of how to align a building with the stars so precisely that it became, in effect, an astronomical instrument, a calendar written in stone and shadow, and there were texts from even further afield. From India, perhaps, where the concept of zero was being born in the minds of mathematicians, who understood that nothingness itself could be a number, that absence could be as powerful as presence. From Persia, where the prophet Zoroaster had spoken of a cosmic struggle between light and darkness that would one day reach its final resolution. From the distant edges of the known world, where travelers had ventured into lands of ice or sand or jungle and returned with stories that seemed more like dreams than memories. All of this vast, shimmering, impossible wealth of human thought rested within the walls of the library, and the scholars who worked there understood that they were not merely librarians, keepers of a flame that, if it were ever extinguished, might never be rulers of Egadime, did not simply wait for cakes. Poetic cry, if scory takes, tossed away takes an equality that be borders on the mayf. For the pedamaic rules of Egai did not simply wait for of, they pursued them with a hunger that was almost predatory. A hunger not for gold or territory, but for words, for knowledge, for the captured thoughts of the world. There is a famous story, and like all the best stories about the library, it exists in that shadowed territory between history and legend, that every ship that entered the harbour of Alexandria was searched. No for contraband, no for weapons, but for books. Any scrolls found aboard were taken to the library, where scribes would make copies. The copies were returned to the ships. The originals were kept. Imagine the audacity of this. Imagine the sheer, breathtaking presumption that a city would claim the right to possess every written thought that passed through its waters. That knowledge, once it entered the orbit of Alexandria, could never entirely leave. Ptolemy III, it is said, once borrowed the official state copies of the great Athenian tragedies, the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, from the city of Athens itself. He paid a deposit of 15 talents of silver, an enormous sum, as a guarantee that the scrolls would be returned. And then, with a craftiness that must have brought a smile to his lips, he kept the originals and sent back copies in their place. Athens kept the silver, Alexandria kept the words, and the words Ptolemy understood were worth infinitely more. This was not theft, precisely, or if it was theft of the most unusual and perhaps the most forgivable kind. The theft of ideas committed not for personal gain, but for the sake of preservation, for the sake of ensuring that no thought, once thought, would ever be lost. The Ptolemies believed, and perhaps they were right, that the only way to protect knowledge was to gather it, to bring it together in one place where it could be studied and copied and compared and understood. The alternative was dispersal, fragmentation, the slow erosion of memory by time and war and neglect. And so the library grew. Year by year, decade, reign by reign, it grew. Scrolls arrived from every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. They arrived in merchant ships and diplomatic pouches. They arrived as gifts and as spoils of war. They arrived in the hands of scholars who had travelled for months across deserts and mountains to reach this one luminous point on the map, carrying with them the intellectual treasures of their homelands. The library became, in a very real sense, the memory of the world. And within that memory, extraordinary things happened, for the library was not merely a place of storage. It was a place of creation, a place where the proximity of so many different traditions, so many different ways of seeing the world, generated a kind of intellectual alchemy that produced discoveries of startling brilliance. It was here, in the Library of Alexandria, that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. Consider this for a moment, more than 2,000 years before the age of satellites and GPS. A man sitting in a library in Egypt, using nothing more than a stick, a shadow, a well, and the geometry of Euclid, determined the size of the planet with an accuracy that still astounds. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun stood directly overhead in the city of Syene, far to the south. He knew this because, on that day, the sun's light fell directly to the bottom of a deep well in Syene, without casting any shadow on the walls. But in Alexandria, at that same moment, a vertical stick cast a shadow. By measuring the angle of that shadow, and by knowing the distance between Alexandria and Syene, Eratosthenes could calculate the curvature of the earth. And from the curvature, the circumference, the answer he arrived at, was remarkably close to the true figure. The earth, he said, was approximately 250,000 stadia in circumference. A measurement that, depending on which definition of the stadion you use, translates to somewhere between 39,000 and 46,000 kilometers. The actual circumference of the Earth at the equator is approximately 40,075 kilometers. Eratosthenes, with his stick and his shadow and his beautiful simple logic, came astonishingly close. But what moves us most about this story is not the precision of the measurement. It is the ambition of the question. Here was a man who stood in a library, surrounded by scrolls, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of centuries, and who dared to ask, how big is the world? No, the world of politics and trade and war, but the actual, physical, spherical world. The world as a body floating in space, the world as an object that could be measured. And he found the answer not by travelling to the edge of the earth, but by thinking, by connecting two observations, a shadow in Alexandria, a shadowless well in Syene, with a line of reasoning so elegant that it seems less like mathematics and more like poetry. This is what the library made possible. No, just the preservation of knowledge, but the connection of knowledge, the weaving together of separate threads into a tapestry of understanding that was greater than any single thread alone. It was here, too, that Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the earth revolves around the sun, 18 centuries before Copernicus. A scholar in Alexandria looked at the heavens and saw what no one else was willing to see, that we are not the center, that the great, warm, life-giving fire of the sun does not circle around us like a servant attending a king, but rather that we circle around it like a moth drawn to a flame, like a child orbiting the warmth of a parent's embrace. Aristarchus could not prove his theory with the tools available to him. The mathematics of elliptical orbits and gravitational attraction lay far in the future, and his idea was largely rejected by his contemporaries, who found it impossible to accept that the Earth, solid, stable, unmoving Earth, could be hurtling through space at unimaginable speeds. The idea was too strange, too unsettling. It asked too much of the human imagination. And so the heliocentric model was set aside. It was placed, gently, like a fragile scroll, on a high shelf in the library of human thought, where it gathered dust for nearly 2 millennia, until until the telescope revealed what the naked eye could not confirm, and what the mind of Aristarchus had somehow intuited in the amber light of the Alexandrian library. One wonders what might have happened if Aristarchus's idea had been accepted, if the ancient world had embraced the heliocentric model and built upon it, as later generations would do. Would the scientific revolution have arrived centuries earlier? Would we have reached the stars by now? These are questions without answers, of course. They belong to the realm of might have been, that ghostly territory where history meets dream, but they haunt us. These questions, they haunt us the way the library itself haunts us, as a reminder of what was possible and of what was lost. And then there was Hypatia. Of all the figures associated with the Library of Alexandria, none is more haunting, more luminous, more heartbreaking than Hypatia. She was a mathematician, an astronomer, a philosopher. She was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, himself a distinguished scholar who had edited and commented upon the works of Euclid and Ptolemy, and she was, by all accounts, one of the most brilliant minds of her age, or of any age. Hypatia taught at the Mausion, or what remained of it by the late 4th and early 5th centuries of the Common Era, for by that time the institution had already suffered greatly from the ravages of war, politics, and religious conflict. She lectured on mathematics and Neoplatonic philosophy to students who came from across the Roman world to hear her speak. She was renowned not only for her intellect, but for her character, her integrity, her courage, her unwillingness to compromise her pursuit of truth for the sake of political convenience. She lived in a time of terrible upheaval. The Roman Empire was fracturing. Christianity was rising as a political as well as a spiritual force, and the old pagan traditions, the traditions that had given birth to the library, the Mausion, the entire culture of classical learning, were being swept aside. In Alexandria, the tension between the Christian authorities and the remaining pagan and Jewish communities had reached a fever pitch. The city was a cauldron of religious and political conflict, and Hypatia, as a prominent pagan intellectual, stood at the very center of the storm. In the year 415, she was murdered. A mob of Christian zealots, some accounts say they were monks, others say they were followers of the Bishop Cyril, dragged her from her chariot, stripped her, and killed her. Some accounts say she was flayed with oyster shells or pottery shards. The details vary, but the brutality does not. She was killed not for any crime, not for any act of violence or sedition, but for what she represented. The old tradition of free inquiry, of questioning, of seeking truth wherever it might lead, regardless of whether that truth was comfortable or convenient or politically useful. Hypatia's death is often spoken of as the symbolic end of the library. Andy is more complex. The library had already forfars long before the Vond. There is a fordic truth in this association, for Patty embodied everything the library stood for. She was the living flame of Alexandrian lime and Wendiren. Let us hold her name in our minds for a moment. Hypatia, let us say it softly, like a prayer. Hypatia, the last light of the library, the last whisper of the ancient world's dream of universal knowledge. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We have spoken of the library's creation and its glories. No, we must speak of its destruction. And here we enter a territory that is as shadowed and uncertain as any landscape in a dream. For the truth is that no one knows exactly how the library was destroyed. No one knows the precise date, the precise cause, the precise sequence of events that led from the greatest collection of knowledge the world had ever known to. Nothing. Silence. The blank, indifferent sky above a ruined city. There are theories, of course. There are stories, but they contradict one another, and none of them tells the whole truth. The destruction of the library was not a single event, but a process. A long, slow unraveling that took place over centuries, with many hands contributing to the damage. And no single hand bearing the full burden of blame. The first catastrophe is often attributed to Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Caesar was in Alexandria, embroiled in the civil war that would eventually make him a master of Rome. He was besieged in the palace quarter by the forces of the Egyptian king Ptolemy XIII. And in the course of the fighting, he ordered his ships in the harbour to be set ablaze. The fire spread from the ships to the docks, and from the docks to the warehouses along the waterfront. And some ancient accounts say that it reached the library itself, destroying thousands upon thousands of scrolls. But did the fire actually reach the library? The evidence is ambiguous. Others say that what burned was not the library itself, but a warehouse near the docks where scrolls were stored awaiting export. Still, others suggest that the fire damaged only a portion of the collection, and that the library continued to function for centuries afterward. Diminished, but not destroyed. Caesar himself, in his own account of the Alexandrian War, makes no mention of burning the library. This silence may mean nothing. Caesar was hardly going to advertise the destruction of one of the world's greatest cultural treasures. But it may also mean that the fire was not as catastrophic as later tradition would have it, that the library survived Caesar's war battered but intact, its wounds severe but not fatal. The second catastrophe came in the year 270 CE, when the Roman Emperor Aurelian recaptured Alexandria from the forces of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. In the fighting, the Brutian, the royal quarter of the city, where the Maution and the library were located, was heavily damaged. Some historians believe that this was the true death blow to the library, the moment when the physical building and the bulk of its collection were destroyed beyond recovery. But again, the evidence is uncertain. We know that the Brutian was damaged. We know that the area was subsequently abandoned and fell into ruin, but we do not know exactly what was lost, or how much of the collection had already been moved to other locations, including the daughter library at the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis in another part of the city. The third catastrophe came in 391 CE, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius issued a decree ordering the destruction of pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire. In Alexandria, the bishop Theophilus led a mob against the Serapeum, and the great temple was torn down. If the daughter library was still housed within the Serapeum at that time, then its contents were surely destroyed or scattered. But once again, we do not know for certain whether the library was still there, or whether it had already been dispersed, or whether the scrolls had been gradually deteriorating for decades, eaten by insects and dampened by the salt air, their ink fading, their papyrus crumbling, their voices growing fainter and fainter until they fell silent forever. And then there is the fourth story, the story of the Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 CE, and the alleged burning of the library by the Caliph Omar, according to this account. When the Arab general Amr ibn al has captured Alexandria, he wrote to the Caliph asking what should be done with the vast collection of books. The Caliph is said to have replied, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree with the Quran, they are dangerous. In either case, they should be destroyed." And so, according to this story, the scrolls were used as fuel to heat the bathhouses of Alexandria, a task that took 6 months to complete. This story is almost certainly apocryphal. It first appears in historical accounts written more than 500 years after the alleged event, and most modern scholars dismiss it as a later invention, perhaps a piece of anti-Islamic propaganda, or perhaps a morality tale about the dangers of religious intolerance. By the time the Arabs arrived in Egypt, the library had almost certainly been gone for centuries. There was nothing left to burn, and so the mystery remains. We do not know how the library died. We know only that it died, that the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world ever assembled was lost. Not in a single dramatic conflagration, but in a slow, grinding process of neglect and conflict and indifference that stretched across centuries. The most precious things die not with a bang but with a whisper, non wante, 10,000 small moments of carelessness, each one in C fucking tone, but together amounting, but together en basso so complete that we can't even say with certainty. It is not just that the knowledge was destroyed, it is that we do not know what the knowledge was. We do not know what we do not know. We are left with a silence, a vast, echoing silence. And we can only fill it with our imagination, our longing, our sense of what might have been. Let us rest here for a moment. Let us breathe. Let us feel the weight of that silence settle around us like a blanket of stars. The night is deep now. The world outside is quiet, and we are here together, in this space between waking and sleeping, where the boundaries between the real and the imagined grow thin and permeable, like the walls of a very old house through which the wind passes freely. Think of the library now not as a building but as a feeling of vastness, a feeling of possibility, a feeling of something infinitely precious that was held for a brief moment in the hands of humanity, and then, through carelessness and conflict and the simple, relentless passage of time, was let go. We have all felt this feeling, in our own small ways. We have all lost things that we cannot replace. A letter from someone who is no longer with us. A photograph that captured a moment of happiness, so fleeting that it seems, in retrospect, to have belonged to a different life. A word spoken in love or gratitude, that we meant to say again but never did, because we believed in our innocence that there would always be time. The library reminds us that there is not always time, that the things we love are fragile, that the knowledge we possess is temporary, that the flame of understanding, however brightly it burns, can be extinguished by a single breath of wind. And yet, and this is the mystery at the heart of it all, and yet the flame persists. No. The same flame, perhaps. No, in the same form, but the impulse to know, to understand, to preserve, to remember. This impulse is as old as humanity itself, and it does not die. It cannot die. It is woven into the very fabric of what we are. Every library that has ever been built, from the clay tablets of Nineveh to the digital archives of our own age, is a testament to this impulse. Every book that has ever been written, every scroll that has ever been inscribed, every story that has ever been told around a fire in the darkness, all of these are echoes of the same dream that gave birth to the Library of Alexandria, the dream that knowledge can be gathered, that memory can be preserved, that the voices of the dead can be heard by the living, and that the living, in turn, can speak to those who have not yet been born. The library is gone, but the dream endures. Let us go deeper now. Let us move through the corridors of the library in our imagination, and let us pause at certain alcoves, certain shelves, certain scrolls that seem to glow with a light of their own in the amber dimness. Here is a scroll that contains the poetry of Sappho. Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos in the 7th century before the Common Era. Sappho, who was called the 10th Muse by Plato himself. Sappho, whose poems of love and longing and loss were so beautiful, so piercingly intimate, that they seem to have been written not on papyrus but on the very surface of the heart. We know that Sappho wrote 9 books of poetry. 9 books. The Library of Alexandria possessed them all. And yet today, of all that vast and luminous body of work, we possess only one complete poem, the Ode to Aphrodite, and a handful of fragments, a few dozen lines, a few hundred words. The rest is gone, lost in the long erosion of centuries, lost in the fires and floods and acts of deliberate destruction that swept through the ancient world like waves through a sandcastle. Think of what those lost poems might have contained. Think of the emotions they might have expressed, the images they might have conjured, the truths about the human heart they might have revealed. We will never know. We have only the fragments, a line here, a phrase there, a single word plucked from the wreckage of a masterpiece. And in those fragments we hear a voice that is at once ancient and utterly contemporary, a voice that speaks of desire and beauty and the terrible sweetness of time passing. Some say an army of horsemen, Sappho wrote. Some say an army of foot soldiers. Some say a fleet of ships is the most beautiful thing on the dark earth. But I say, it is whatever you love. Whatever you love. This is the principle upon which the library was built. No, the love of power or wealth or conquest, but the love of understanding, the love of beauty, the love of truth. And here, a few alcoves further down, is a scroll containing the lost works of Aeschylus. Aeschylus, the father of Greek tragedy, who fought at the Battle of Marathon, and who transformed the art of theatre from a simple religious ceremony into a profound exploration of the human condition. We know that Aeschylus wrote between 70 and 90 plays. Of these, only 7 survive. 7 out of 90. The rest were in the library. The rest are gone. What stays? Tell what heroes rose and fell upon their stages, what courses once where those plays were, and what dark prophes did their oars pronounce. Pronounce. We can only imagine. We can only stand before the salons where those plays once were, what plays once were to feel the weight of absing against us like the tape. And here, further still, in a section of the library where the lamps burn low and the shadows gather like robed figures at a ceremony. Here are the truly lost works, the works that we know existed only because other writers mentioned them, the works whose titles are all that survive, floating in the historical record, like the names of ships that sailed into a storm and were never seen again. There was a history of the world, written by Berossus, a Babylonian priest who lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Berossus had access to temple records and cuneiform archives that stretched back thousands of years, records that documented the earliest known civilizations of Mesopotamia, the rise and fall of Sumer and Akkad and Babylon, the great flood that appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh centuries later in the Book of Genesis. His history, the Babyloniaca, was a comprehensive account of Babylonian civilization from the world to the time of T-Wall. It was pre-Isadim S-the-B in IP. We have only quotations and summaries preserved in the works of later writers, of A. Cray Ben Twinchu, Hang Please Panaras Payman. There was a work by Manetho, an Egyptian priest of the 3rd century BCE, who wrote a history of Egypt, the Egyptiaca, that organized the pharaohs into the dynastic system that Egyptologists Manetho had access to temple archives and sacred texts that stretched back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. His work was the key to understanding the chronology of one of the most remarkable cultures the world has ever known. It was in the library. It is now lost, surviving only in fragments and summaries that later historians preserved. There was a comprehensive history of Alexander the Great written by his court historian, Callisthenes, who accompanied Alexander on his campaigns and recorded them as they happened. This was not a history written from a distance of centuries, colored by legend and distorted by time. This was an eyewitness account, written by a man who walked beside Alexander, who ate with him, who watched him conquer the known world. It was in the library. It is gone. There were the complete works of Democritus, the philosopher who first proposed the idea that all matter is composed of tiny indivisible particles called atoms. More than 60 works. According to some caches, a mobbed might have anticate modern physics by 2002 asses, Corkentipri Fort and D. Veep. We know his ideas only through the summaries and criticisms of other philosophers, many of whom disagreed with him and may not have represented his views fairly. Scroll after scroll, voice after voice, all of them gathered here in this one impossible place, like stars gathered in a constellation, and all of them, one by one, winking out, going dark, falling silent. The loss is incalculable. No, just in terms of specific texts or specific ideas, but in terms of the connections between ideas. The library was not just a collection of individual works, it was a web of relationships between works. A scholar reading Aristotle could reach for a scroll of Plato to compare their views. A student of astronomy could consult the observations of Babylonian priests alongside the mathematical models of Greek geometers. The whole was greater than the sum of its parts, because the parts were in conversation with one another, and that conversation generated insights that no single work, read in isolation, could have produced. When the library was destroyed, it was not just the individual scrolls that were lost. It was the web, the network, the living, breathing ecosystem of ideas that had sustained some of the most brilliant minds the world has ever known. And that ecosystem, once destroyed, could not be rebuilt. The threads had been cut. The connections had been severed. And the world was left to stumble forward in a darkness that was in a very real sense the darkness of forgetting. Let us walk a little further now. The hour is growing late, and the lamp in our imagined library is burning low. The shadows have deepened. The air has grown cooler, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the faint, almost imperceptible fragrance of ancient papyrus. A smell like dried flowers, like old wood, like the memory of sunlight captured in a jar and opened years later in a darkened room. Let us speak now of the library, not as a place of learning, but as a symbol. For the Library of Alexandria has become, over the centuries, something more than a historical fact. It has become a myth, a sacred story that we tell ourselves about the nature of knowledge and the fragility of civilization. And like all sacred stories, it speaks to something deep within us, something that cannot be expressed in the language of facts and dates and archaeological evidence, but only in the language of longing, of loss, of the ache that we feel when we contemplate something beautiful that has been taken from us and cannot be returned. The library has become the archetype of the lost paradise of knowledge. It is our intellectual Eden, the garden from which we were exiled, the place where everything was known, and everything was connected, and everything made sense. And just as the story of Eden speaks to our longing for innocence and wholeness, the story of the library speaks to our longing for understanding, for a time when all the pieces of the puzzle were gathered in one place, and the picture they formed was clear and luminous and whole. Of course, this is a romanticization. The library was a real institution with real limitations, real politics, real failures. No, everything was gathered there. No, everything was understood. The of Alexandria were brilliant, but they were also human, subject to care. Eragese was a place. Eraser, all the other, eslikens, that be, hence, the human mind. The library was not a paradise, it was a place. A remarkable, extraordinary, world-changing place, but a place nonetheless. The may complicate, imperfect reality of human history. The dream persists, because the dream is not about the library as it actually was, but about the library as we wish it had been, and as we wish the world could be. A world in which knowledge is treasured above power. A world in which curiosity is treated as a sacred calling. A world in which the voices of the past are heard and honored, and the wisdom of all civilizations is gathered together in a spirit of humility and wonder. This is the dream that the library embodies, and it is a dream worth dreaming. Even now, perhaps especially now, in an age when information is more abundant than it has ever been, but wisdom sometimes seems as rare as rain in the desert. There is a moment, late at night, when the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes so thin that you can almost feel it. A membrane of consciousness, delicate as a soap bubble, trembling at the edge of dissolution. In that moment, the mind is open in a way that it rarely is during the daylight hours, open to images that arrive unbidden, open to connections that the rational mind would dismiss, open to the whisper of something that might be memory or might be imagination or might be something else entirely, something for which we have no name. It is in that moment that the library feels most real, most present, most alive, for the library exists now in the same space where dreams exist. It has passed beyond the realm of history and into the realm of the imagi, of the human thashai, of ashai, geweg as not a pie, and be made as be, and speak. And in that terrell be and speak, and in that terretai, it is not a paragraph in a history book or a footnote in a Namek paper. It is a living place, a place where the lamps still burn and the scrolls still whisper, and the scholars still walk through gardens of jasmine and starlight, their robes trailing behind them like the tails of comets, their minds alive with the wonder of a world that is always revealing itself, always opening like a flower, always offering one more secret to those who have the patience and the courage to seek it. This is the library that we carry within us, the inner library, the library of the soul. And it cannot be destroyed, because it is not made of papyrus and ink. It is made of longing, of wonder, of the deep, ineradicable human need to know. Let us speak now of the builders. No, the kings and generals who ordered the library's construction, but the nameless ones, the scribes, the translators, the cataloguers, the copyists, whose patient, painstaking labor made the library what it was. For without these quiet figures, working day after day in the amber light of the reading rooms, the library would have been nothing more than a building. It was their hands, their eyes, their devotion that filled it with meaning. Imagine a scribe at work. He sits at a low desk, his legs crossed beneath him, a reed pen in his right hand and a small pot of ink at his side. Before him lies a sheet of papyrus, smooth golden white, freshly cut and pressed, and before that, propped on a wooden stand, is the scroll he is copying, perhaps an old scroll, its edges frayed, its surface darkened with age, its ink fading to a ghostly brown. He reads a line, he dips his pen, he writes slowly, carefully, with an attention so focused that it becomes a kind of meditation. Each letter is formed with precision. Each word is placed upon the page with the deliberateness of a mason laying a stone. He is not merely copying words. He is transmitting knowledge across time. He is building a bridge between the past and the future, and each letter is a plank in that bridge, and each word is a step. and each scroll is a span that carries the weight of centuries. He does not know this, of course. He does not think of himself as building bridges or transmitting knowledge or eyes. He thinks of himself as doing his job. He thinks of the shape in his back. He thinks of the meal that awaits him when his shift is over bread and she perhaps of water when fee. He thinks of the warmth of his bed and the softness of the night air that will drift through his window as he falls asleep. And yet, without knowing it, he is doing something sacred. He is performing an act of preservation that is, in its own quiet way, as heroic as any battle, as monumental as any pyramid. He is saving a voice from oblivion. He is reaching back through time and grasping the hand of a stranger, a writer who may have lived centuries before him, in a land he has never visited, in a culture he barely understands, and pulling that stranger forward into the future, into the light. There were hundreds of these scribes, perhaps thousands. We do not know their names, we do not know their faces. They left no grand inscription their achievements. Only the act of cocking that survive. That him been write it again to multiply as a sukaza endways story that I amplores is with us still. Every time we share a book with a friend, every time we read a day, every time we tell a story that was told to us someone, we are copying the scroll, we are building the bridge, we are keeping the flame alive. And then there were the translators. If the scribes were the hands of the library, the translators were its tongue, for the library contained texts in dozens of languages, and the work of translating these texts, of carrying meaning from one language to another, like a cup of water carried from one well to the next, was among the most important and most delicate tasks that the library's scholars undertook. The most famous translation project associated with the library is the creation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. According to legend, Ptolemy II, eager to add the sacred texts of the Jewish people to his collection, invited 72 Jewish scholars to Alexandria and asked them to translate their scriptures into Greek. The scholars were housed in separate rooms on the island where the great lighthouse stood whip and found, to be word for word lound, to be furt the lekkerseffen, after semten to fiend gente kli, for word, as if the translation had been dictated not by human minds but by the divine breath itself. This story is, of course, a legend. The actual process of translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek was far more complex and far less miraculous, extending over many decades and involving many different translators with varying degrees of skill and faithfulness. But the legend tells us something important about how the people of Alexandria viewed the act of translation. They viewed it as sacred, as a kind of miracle, as an act that required not just linguistic skill but divine inspiration, the breath of God moving through the translator's pen, ensuring that the truth of the original was preserved even as it was carried into a new language, a new culture, a new world of meaning. And in a sense, every act of translation is a miracle, for language is not merely a set of symbols. Language is a way of seeing the world. Each language contains within it a unique perspective, a unique set of assumptions about what is real and what is important and what is beautiful. When we translate from one language to another, we are not merely substituting one set of words for another. We are carrying a way of being from one world to another, and in that carrying, something is always lost. Some nuance, some connotation, some subtle shade of meaning that exists in the original but has no equivalent in the target language. But something is also gained. A new audience, a new context, a new life for the text in a world that the original author could never have imagined. The translators of the Library of Alexandria understood this. They understood that their work was both an act of preservation and an act of creation. That every translation was a new text, a text that owed its existence to the original, but that was also, in some fundamental sense, its own thing. a new voice speaking in a new language about the same eternal truths. And through their work, the boundaries between civilizations became permeable. Greek readers could access the wisdom of Egypt. Egyptian readers could access the philosophy of Greece. Hebrew scripture could speak to a world far beyond the borders of Judea. And in this exchange, this constant flowing conversation between cultures, something new was being born. Not Greek, not Egyptian, not Hebrew, but something larger, something more inclusive, something that transcended the limitations of any single tradition and pointed toward a vision of human knowledge that was truly universal. This was the library's greatest achievement. No, the number of stations it made possible, the pigeon Tibodor, that had neverent languages and custodian beliefs, the Sus and Bichos before the same the search for midi far, we are all beneath or different languages and gestotimes. Beliefs Siade, the search for the answer to the question that every human being in every age and every culture has whispered into the darkness before falling asleep. What is all of this? What does it mean? And does it matter that I was here? The night deepens. The stars wheel slowly overhead, tracing their ancient patterns across the sky. And in our imagined library, the lamps have burned down to a soft golden glow, casting circles of warm light on the stone floor. Each circle a small island of illumination in a sea of shadow. Let us speak now of the catalogue, for a library is not merely a collection of texts. It is an organized collection of texts, and the organization, the system by which texts are classified, sorted, shelved, and made findable, is itself a kind of knowledge, a map of knowledge, a way of saying, this is how we understand the world, this is how we see the relationships between things, this is the shape of what we know. The first great catalogue of the library was created by Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and scholar who worked in the library during the 3rd century before the Common Era. His catalogue, known as the Penachos, the tables, was a monumental work of classification that ran to 120 scrolls. 120 scrolls, just to describe the contents of the library. This gives us some sense of the collection's immensity. Callimachus organized the Penachos into categories: rhetoric, law, epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, medicine, mathematics, natural science, and miscellaneous. Within each category, authors were listed alphabetically, and for each author, Callimachus provided a brief biography and a list of works, along with the first line of each work and the total number of lines it contained. The Penachos was not just a catalogue, it was a portrait of knowledge itself, a snapshot of everything that the ancient world had written and thought and dreamed, organized into a system that made it accessible and navigable. It was, in a sense, the ancestor of every library catalogue, every index, every search engine that has ever been created. And like so much else that was born in the Library of Alexandria, it is now lost. We have only fragments, quoted and paraphrased by later writers, like faded reflections in a broken mirror. But even in its absence, the Penachos tells us something profound. It tells us that the scholars of Alexandria understood that knowledge, without organization, that information, without structure, is noise, that the act of classifying, of saying this belongs here, and that belongs there, and these two things are related in this way, is itself an act of understanding, a way of making sense of the world's bewildering complexity, a way of turning the raw, unordered flood of human experience into something that can be grasped, studied and transmitted. And there is something poetic, deeply, hauntingly poetic, about the idea of a catalogue of lost books, a map of a territory that no longer exists, a guide to a country that has vanished from the face of the earth. The Penachos is like a constellation of stars that have gone out, each entry a point of light that once was and now is not, but whose pattern, whose arrangement, whose relationship to the other stars, still tells us something about the shape of the sky as it once was. We are deep in the library now, deep in the night, deep in the space between waking and dreaming, where the past and the present flow together, like two rivers merging into one. Let us speak of the objects that were in the library. No, just the scrolls, but the physical things, the instruments, the artifacts, the curiosities that were gathered in the Mauschen alongside the texts. For the Mauschen was not just a library, it was also a museum, a research institute, a university. It had lecture halls and laboratories. It had a botanical garden where exotic plants were cultivated and studied. It had a zoo, or something like a zoo, where unusual animals from distant lands were kept for observation. It had an observatory, where astronomers tracked the movements of the stars. And it had collections of objects, minerals, fossils, anatomical specimens, mechanical devices that the scholars used in their research. Imagine a room in the Mauschen where mechanical wonders are kept. Here, on a wooden table, sits a small device made of bronze and ivory. It is a model of the solar system, a kind of ori with tiny spheres, repris to moon and their correct orbits. Orbis, Wal Mon. The device was built by one of the Mauschen's engineers, and it demonstrates in a tangible, physical way the mathematical relationships between the celestial bodies. Next to it, perhaps, is something even more astonishing. A steam engine. No, a full-size industrial steam engine, of course, but a small device attributed to Hero of Alexandria that uses the power of steam to spin a sphere on an axis. Hero called it an eolipile, after Eolus, the god of the winds. It was a toy, essentially, a novelty, a demonstration piece, a conversation starter at dinner parties, and yet it contained in embryonic form the principle that would one day power the Industrial Revolution and transform the world beyond recognition. Think about this. In the 1st century of the Common Era, a scholar in Alexandria built a working steam engine, and nothing came of it. The device was admired, discussed, and set aside. No one thought to scour for practical purposes. To use it to pemposarmic and or drive machi, the idea was there. The germ of the idea, at least, but the world was not ready for it. The social and economic conditions that would make storm power. What ifs of history? What if Heroes, a team engine, had been developed? Eroa, in the first time have begun, in the first anti, instead of the anti, in C of the course, ipst potential, and paydine hebine de edine, in the 1st century, instead of the 18th, could the ancient world have leapt forward into a kind of technological modernity that we can barely imagine? The reasons are complex. Economic, social, political, philosophical. The ancient world relied on slave labor, which made labor-saving devices less appealing. The philosophical tradition of the Greeks valued contemplation over practical application, theory over technology, and the materials available to ancient engineers, bronze, wood, leather, were not well suited to the construction of high-pressure steam machinery. But the thought lingers. The possibility haunts, and it adds another layer to the already deep melancholy of the library's story. It is not just knowledge that was lost in Alexandria. It was potential, the seeds of futures that were never born, the maps of roads that were never traveled. Let us pause here and breathe again. Let us feel the slow rhythm of our own hearts, beating in the darkness, like the footsteps of a traveler, walking a very long road. The Library of Alexandria was a place of fire, the fire of oil lamps burning through the night, the fire of intellectual passion, the fire that eventually consumed the scrolls. But it was also a place of water. It stood at the edge of the Mediterranean, that great inner sea that connected all the civilizations of the ancient world. The harbour of Alexandria was one of the busiest in the ancient world, and the library drew its life from the sea. as surely as a plant draws its life from the rain. Water brought the scrolls. Water brought the ideas that mingled and merged within the library's walls, like currents in a tidal pool, and water, in time, took much of it away. The salt air corroding the papyrus, the damp seeping into the storerooms, the rising groundwater undermining the foundations. There is something fitting about this, something cyclical, something that speaks to the ancient understanding of the world as a place of perpetual flux, where all things arise and all things pass away, where creation and destruction are not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance. The philosopher Heraclitus, whose works, incidentally, were almost certainly in the library, said that all things flow, panterai. Everything moves, everything changes, nothing stays. You cannot step into the same river twice, because the river has changed and so have you. The library was a river of knowledge flowing through time. For a few centuries, it gathered itself into a great shining pool, a place of extraordinary depth and clarity. But rivers do not stay in pools. They move on, they scatter, they find new channels, new pathways, new destinations. And the knowledge that was gathered in Alexandria did not simply vanish when the library was destroyed. Much of it survived, in copies, in quotations, in the memories of scholars who had studied there and who carried what they had learned to other places. The knowledge flowed east, into the Islamic world, where scholars in Baghdad and Damascus and Cordoba translated Greek texts into Arabic and preserved them for future generations. It flowed north, into the monasteries of medieval Europe, where monks copied ancient manuscripts by candlelight, often without fully understanding what they were copying, but preserving the words nonetheless. It flowed south, into the libraries of Timbuktu and the teaching centers of North Africa. It flowed in all directions like water finding its level, like starlight spreading through the darkness. The library was destroyed, but the knowledge survived. No, all of it. No, most of it. Enough to see the Renaissance. Enough to inspire the scientific revolution. Enough to remind us, across the gulf of centuries, that there was once a place where humanity gathered its scattered thoughts into a single, luminous whole, and where the dream of universal understanding burned, for a brief and shining moment, with a flame, for no account of Alexandria would be complete without the lighthouse. The Pharos of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which stood on the island of Pharos at the entrance to the harbour, and guided ships to safety with its great fire. The lighthouse was built during the reign of Ptolemy II, around 280 BCE, and it stood for more than 1,000 years before being destroyed by a series of earthquakes in the 14th century. At its peak, it was one of the tallest structures in the ancient world. Estimates range from 100 to 140 meters, and its light, amplified by a great mirror of polished bronze, could be seen from a distance of more than 50 kilometers out at sea. Imagine it. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship in the open Mediterranean, the night pressing in from all sides, the stars wheeling overhead, the waves dark and endless and indifferent. And then, on the horizon, a light, a single, steady, golden light, burning through the darkness like a promise, a light that says, here is safety, here is harbour, here is home. The lighthouse and the library were sisters. They were born from the same impulse, the impulse to illuminate. The lighthouse illuminated the sea, guiding travellers to a safe harbour. The library illuminated the mind, guiding seekers to a safe harbour of understanding. Both were acts of generosity, offerings to the world, gifts of light in a dark, and both were vulnerable. Both were ultimately destroyed. The lighthouse fell to earthquakes. The library fell to, well, to everything. To fire and war and neglect, and the slow, inexorable grinding of time against the works of human hands. But the light persists. No, the physical light of the lighthouse was extinguished centuries ago, but the metaphorical light, the inner light, the of knowledge and understanding that the library represented, and that continues to be in lapis and research institutions, and in the quiet that way, driven by the same hunger for understanding that drove the scholars of Alexandria 20 TDA far. You, reading this, or listening to this, in the quiet of the night, you, with your curiosity and your wonder and your willingness to journey into the past in search of something that matters, you are the continuation of the Alexandrian dream. You are the latest link in a chain of seekers that stretches back through millennia, through countless libraries and countless languages, through fire and flood and the fall of empires, all the way back to that first moment when a human being looked at a mark on a clay tablet and realized that it meant something, that it carried a thought. You are the library. Now, you carry it within you. And every time you seek to understand, every time you ask a question, every time you reach across the distance of centuries to touch the hand of someone who lived and thought and wondered long before you were born, you are keeping the flame alive. The hour grows very late now. The stars are beginning to fade at the eastern edge of the sky, though the night still holds its depth and its mystery. In our imagined library, the last lamp has burned down to a faint, warm ember, casting just enough light to see the outlines of the scrolls on their shelves, row upon row of them, receding into the shadows, like an avenue of ancient trees. Let us speak, before we close, of the silence, for the library is, above all, a place of silence. No, the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, the silence of a vessel so brimful of meaning that it cannot speak, the silence of a sky so full of stars that it has no room for words, the silence that comes after a great piece of music has ended, when the last note has faded, and the air is still trembling with its memory. This is the silence of the lost library, the silence of all those vanished voices, all those erased thoughts, all those forgotten dreams. It is a silence that speaks more eloquently than any text. A silence that tells us, in its own wordless way, that the most important things are often the things we cannot say in world. Mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphetison to secrecy, Orsido of the Pichagolan, all place of Ide Precibi, all place of she. The deepest truths were considered too sacred to be spoken aloud, too fragile to survive the rough handling of ordinary language. They could only be communicated in silence, in the shared understanding that passes between two minds in a moment of mutual recognition, like the look that passes between two people who have both seen the same star falling. The library honored this tradition. For all its vast collection of written words, the library understood that writing is not the whole of knowledge, that there are truths that cannot be written down, that the deepest understanding is not something that can be stored on a shelf or catalogued in a pinax, but something that must be experienced directly in the silence of one's own contemplation. This is perhaps the library's deepest lesson. No, that knowledge should be preserved, though it should, but that knowledge is not enough. That beyond knowledge lies wisdom, and beyond wisdom lies something else, something for which we have no word, something that the mystics of all traditions have tried to point toward, but that always, in the end, eludes the grasp of language. Lined, the wisdom was in this between the laws. Let us western but as a be listening, the weight of all those be's and dars, the weight of all those voicing, the weight of all those be listening, the weight of all that beauty and all that loss gathered together into a single sacred moment of stillness. The library is gone, but we are here, and in this moment, this quiet, fleeting, unrepeatable moment, the past and the present are one, the ancient and the modern are one, the lost and the found are one. Let the last images of the library, the golden light, the marble columns, the whisper of papyrus, the scent of jasmine and salt air, let them dissolve into the darkness, like reflections dissolving into still water. You are safe. You are held. You are part of a story that is older than memory, and that will continue long after you and I are gone. A story of seeking and finding and losing and seeking again. A story of light in the darkness. A story of the human mind reaching out across the void, desperate to touch something real, something true, something that endures. The library whispers to you now. Can you hear it? It is very faint. It has always been there. And it will minds that wonder and hearts that seek and souls that perfuster. Become your peace, silence. Become your peace in now, seeped now. Sleep, now, sleep now. Spee, all speece, become your laby. The great lighthouse has gone dark. Its fire extinguished by the weight of centuries. But in the sky above, the stars still burn. The same stars that the scholars of the Mauritian watched from their observatory. The same stars that Aristarchus measured, and Eratosthenes mapped, and Hipparchus catalogued, in his great star catalogue, a work that was itself preserved in the library, and is now, like so much else, lost. The same stars, the same light, travelling across unfathomable distances of space and time, to reach your eyes at this very moment. The light you see when you look at a star is ancient light. Light that has been travelling for years, or centuries, or millennia. When you look at a star, you are looking into the past. You are seeing the universe as it was, not as it is. And in this sense, the stars are like the scrolls of the library. Each one is a message from the past, preserved in light, instead of ink, travelling through the void to reach a reader who was not yet born when the message was sent. Each star is a voice crying out across the darkness. I was here. I existed. Remember me. The library understood this. The library knew that all knowledge is, in a sense, starlight. A message from the past, travelling through time, hoping to find a mind that will receive it and understand. And so, as you drift towards sleep, let the last image in your mind be this: a sky full of stars above an ancient harbour, and below it, in the soft golden glow of a lamp that burns in a room that no longer exists, a single scroll, lying open on a table, its surface covered with words that no living person can read, its meaning lost but its beauty, heartbreaking beauty, somehow intact, somehow surviving, somehow speaking, even now, in a language that the sleeping mind, freed from the constraints of logic and language, can almost understand. Almost, and perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will understand it fully. Perhaps in the country that lies just beyond the borders of waking. You will walk through the doors of the library of Find It Whole. Find it luminous. Find every scose of. Perhaps you will pull a scroll from a shelf, any scroll chosen at random, and unroll it, and read a line, a single line, written in a hand that has been dust for 2,000 years. And perhaps that line will contain the answer to a question you have carried all your life. A question so deep, so fundamental, that you had almost forgotten. And perhaps in that moment, in the dream library that exists beyond time and beyond loss, you will understand what the scholars of Alexandria understood. That knowledge is sacred. That the human mind is a temple. That the act of seeking truth is an act of worship. And that the flame, once lit, cannot truly be extinguished. Not by fire, not by water, not by the fall of empires, not by the passage of millennia. Because the flame is not in the scrolls. The flame is not in the building. The flame is in us. in the quiet, persistent, inextinguishable wonder that brought you here tonight. To this story, to this silence, to this place where the ancient and the eternal meet and merge and become one. Sleep now. The library is dreaming, and you are its dream. In the silence that follows, there is a faint sound, so faint that you might mistake it for the sound of your own breathing, or the distant murmur of the sea, or the whisper of wind through an open window. But it is none of these things. It is the sound of pages turning, of scrolls unrolling, of voices speaking across the centuries in the soft, unhurried cadence of scholars, who know that time, for them, is not a river rushing toward a waterfall, but a still pool deep, clear, and inexhaustible. There is a passage in the writings of the Roman philosopher Seneca, a passage that may or may not have been inspired by his own reflections on the library, in which he says, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it." And this, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of the library. No, that time is short, though it is, but that time is precious. That every moment spent in the pursuit of understanding is a moment rescued from oblivion. That every question asked in earnest is a candle lit in the darkness. That every act of curiosity is an act of faith. Faith that the universe is intelligible. Faith that truth exists. Faith that the human mind, for all its frailty, is capable of touching something real. The scholars of Alexandria lived this faith. They embodied it. They poured their lives into it with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. And when the library fell, when the scrolls burned and the columns crumbled and the gardens were buried beneath the dust of centuries, their faith did not fall with it. It endured. It endures in the great national libraries with their millions of volumes and their climate-controlled storage vaults, in the small village libraries with their worn carpets and their shelves of donated paperbacks, in the digital libraries that exist nowhere and everywhere, their contents floating in the cloud, like thoughts in the mind of a dreaming God. It endures in the mind of every child who picks up a book and falls into it, tumbling through worlds of imagination and wonder, discovering that the marks on the page are not just marks, they are doors, doors that open onto vistas of thought and feeling that stretch beyond the horizon, beyond the limits of a single life, beyond the boundaries of time itself. It endures in you. And now, let us trace one more thread through the library's history. An easily overlow, but that li, mau, is po, if we follow it carefully, to a place of quiet, in the 2nd century before the Common Era. A scholar named Aristophanes of Byzantium, as the headlion of the great library. He was not the first head librarian. That honor belongs to Zenodotus of Ephesus, who organized the initial collection, nor the most famous. That distinction is usually given to Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference. But Aristophanes of Byzantium made a contribution to human civilization that is so fundamental, so pervasive, that we use it every day without ever thinking about it. He invented punctuation. Before Aristophanes, Greek texts were written in a continuous stream of letters. No spaces between words, no marks to indicate pauses, no symbols to distinguish a question from a statement. Reading such a text was an act of interpretation. The reader had to determine for themselves where one word ended and the next began, where to pause for be, where the meaning shift. It was like trying to follow a conversation in a crowded room where everyone is speaking at once. Aristophanes introduced a system of dots, placed at different heights, to indicate pauses of different lengths. A dot at the top of a line indicated a long pause, what we would now call a period. A dot at the middle indicated a medium pause, something like our semicolon or colon. A dot at the bottom indicated a short pause. Similar to our comma, these marks were simple, almost humble. They were not grand ideas or revolutionary theories. They were small, practical tools, little points of ink on papyrus, designed to make the act of reading easier and more accurate. And yet their impact was incalculable. Punctuation did not just change the way people read, it changed the way people thought. By introducing pauses and breaks into the flow of text, Aristophanes gave readers a framework for understanding the structure of an argument, the rhythm of a narrative, the emotional arc of a poem. Punctuation made meaning visible. It turned the invisible architecture of thought into something that could be seen on the page, like the hidden framework of a building suddenly revealed by a shaft of light. We take punctuation for granted now. We use it instinctively, barely noticing the commas and periods and question marks that guide our reading. But every one of those marks is a descendant of Aristophanes' dots. Every one of them is a tiny echo of the Library of Alexandria, a whisper from the past that shapes, in ways we rarely acknowledge, the way we understand the present. Even the pause between these sentences, the brief, almost imperceptible moment of silence that you experience each time you reach a period, is a gift from the library, a gift from a scholar who lived more than 2,000 years ago and who understood that silence properly placed gives meaning to sound, that the pause is as important as the word, that what is left unsaid is as powerful as what is said. Rest in that pause now. Feel its weight, its texture, its quiet power. There is another story about the library that is too beautiful not to tell, even though it may be apocryphal. It concerns the physician Herophilus, who worked in Alexandria during the 3rd century, before the Common Era, and who is sometimes called the father of anatomy. Herophilus was one of the first people in the Western world to systematically dissect human bodies for the purpose of understanding their structure. This was a radical act. In most of the ancient world, the bodies of the dead were considered sacred and inviolable, and the idea of cutting them open for the sake of knowledge was viewed with horror and revulsion. But in Alexandria, under the patronage of the early Ptolemies, Herophilus was given permission to conduct his dissections, and the knowledge he gained was extraordinary. He identified the brain as the seat of intelligence, contradicting Aristotle, who had believed that the heart. He distinguished between arteries and veins. He described the structure of the eye, the liver, the reproductive organs. He identified and named the duodenum, the first section of the small intestine, a name we still use today, and he made detailed observations of the nervous system, tracing the nerves from the brain to the extremities, and demonstrating that they were the channels through which sensation and movement traveled. Some ancient sources claim that Herophilus conducted his dissections not on corpses but on living prisoners, criminals condemned to death, who were handed over to him by the Ptolemaic authorities. This accusation is almost certainly an exaggeration, if not an outright fabrication, propagated by later writers who wished to discredit Herophilus and the Alexandrian tradition of anatomical research. But the accusation itself tells us something about the unease that the library's relentless pursuit of knowledge sometimes provoked. There was a sense, even in the ancient world, that the quest for understanding could go too far, that some knowledge was too dangerous, too forbidden, too close to the divine, that the act of looking too deeply into the bods, or the souls, was an act of looking too much runs like a fear, of knowing too much runs like a free, of the entire history of the entire history of the thorde, a q lion ed a for one's like a three of runs like a free through the entire history. It is the tension that animates the myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and was punished for it. It is the tension that drives the story of Adam and Eve, who ate from the tree of knowledge and were expelled from paradise. It is the tension that underlies every debate about the ethics of scientific research, every argument about the limits of human inquiry, every moment of doubt that a scholar feels when standing at the edge of a discovery that might change everything. The Library of Alexandria stood at the very center of this tension. It was a place that dared to know, that dared to ask, that dared to look into the darkest corners of the universe and the most hidden chambers of the human body and say, let us understand, let us see, let us not be afraid, and for that daring, whether the price was fair, whether the destruction of the library was a punishment, or merely a consequence of the human penchant for violence and neglect. These are questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. In the silence of our own contemplation, we are nearing the end of our journey now. The night has grown very old, and the first faint hints of dawn are beginning to touch the eastern sky. Not light, not yet, but the memory of light, the promise of light. The knowledge that light will come again, as it has always come, as it will always come, no matter how long or how deep the darkness. And in that almost light, let us speak one final time of the library. As a building or a collection or an institution, but as an idea so powerful. So Endar is the Olnoge into the fact of human is the Olnod is one. Endar idin no, itine no nogitine. That every field of human inquiry, science and philosophy, mathematics and poetry, history and medicine, astronomy and music, is not a separate, isolated domain, but a part of a single, vast, interconnected whole. That the universe is not a collection of unrelated fragments, but a unity. A great, shimmering web of meaning in which everything is connected to everything else, and in which the discovery of any single truth illuminates all the others. This was the idea that the library embodied. This was the principle upon which it was built, and this was the dream that it bequeathed to us. The dream that somewhere, somehow, all the scattered pieces of human understanding can be gathered together into a single luminous whole, and that when they are, they will reveal not just the structure of the world, but its meaning, its purpose, its beauty. We have not yet achieved this dream. We may never achieve it. The universe may be too vast, too complex, too mysterious for any single mind or any single institution to comprehend. But the dream itself is precious. The dream itself is sacred, and the act of dreaming it, the act of reaching for it, however imperfectly, however incompletely, is perhaps the noblest thing that human beings do. The Library of Alexandria was the most magnificent expression of this dream that the ancient world ever produced. And though the library is gone, the dream survives. It survives in every act of intellectual curiosity, in every moment of wonder, in every question asked by a child staring up at the stars, in every scholar's late-night vigil over a difficult text, in every artist's struggle to capture something true and beautiful and permanent in a world that is always changing, always flowing, always slipping through our fingers like water. The dream survives in you. And so we come to the end of our journey through the library, the end of our walk through corridors that no longer exist, past shelves that no longer hold their scrolls, beneath lamps that no longer burn. But something remains. Something lingers, a whisper. Can you hear it? It is very faint, very soft, very far away, but it is there. It has always been there. Is the whisper of the library, the whisper of all those voices, Homer and Sappho, Plato and Aristotle, Euclid and Eratosthenes, Herophilus and Hipparchus, Aristarchus and Callimachus, Hypatia, and 1,000 others whose names we will never know, all of them speaking at once, all of them saying the same thing in 1,000 different languages, in 1,000 different ways. Remember. Remember US. Remember what we sought. Remember why it mattered. Remember that the flame of knowledge is the most precious thing that human beings possess, and that it must be guarded and tended and passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation, from age to age, without ever being allowed to go out. Remember, and now sleep. Sleep in the knowledge that the library holds you, that its whisper is your lullaby, that its silence is your peace, that its dream, the oldest, the most beautiful, the most sacred of all human dreams, is dreaming you even as you dream it. The library whispers, and you are listening, and that is enough. That has always been enough. In the fading light of our imagined lamp, one last image presents itself. No an image of ruin or loss, but an image of continuity, of connection, of the thread that runs from then to now, and from now to whatever comes next. In the year 2002, a new library was built in Alexandria. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the Library of Alexandria reborn. It stands near the site of the original on the shore of the Mediterranean. Its great circular roof, tilted toward the sea like a sundial, like an eye looking up at the sky, like a satellite dish, tuned to the frequency of the universe. It is not the same library. It cannot be the same library. 23 centuries of history stand between the original and its descendant, and the gulf between them is too vast to be bridged by bricks and mortar alone. The new library holds books, not scrolls. It has computers, not copyists. It exists in a world that the scholars of the Maushan could not have imagined. A world of electricity and internet, of satellites and artificial intelligence, of knowledge so abundant that the challenge is no longer to gather it but to navigate it. And yet the dream is the same. The impulse is the same. The hunger is the same. The new library stands as a testament to the stubbornness of the human spirit, to our refusal to accept that what has been lost cannot be regained, to our belief, irrational, perhaps but indomitable, that the flame can be relit, that the voices can be heard again, that the silence can be broken. It is a small gesture in the face of all that was lost, a candle lit in a cathedral of darkness, but it is a gesture of faith. And faith, as the scholars of the original library understood, is the beginning of all knowledge. The night is over now, or nearly over. The stars are fading. The sky is turning from black to deep blue. Somewhere a bird is beginning to sing. The first tentative notes of a song that has been sung every morning since the dawn of time. And the library is fading, too, fading back into the mist of history and lend from which we surmined it. Beplependes sauve and dissolve. The scrolls are rolling themselves up and returning to their shelves, and the shelves are returning to the walls, and the walls are returning to the earth, and the earth is returning to the silence from which all things come, and to which all things, in the end, return. But the whisper remains. It will always remain. Carry it with you into the morning. Carry it with you into the light. Let it be the first thought you remember when you wake, the thought that somewhere, in a city by the sea, in a time so long ago that it might as well be a dream, there was a place where all the knowledge of the world was gathered into one room, and where the act of reading was an act of prayer, and where the human mind, in all its fragility and all its grandeur, reached out toward the infinite, and for one brief, shining moment touched it. The library that whispered beneath the starlight. It is whispering still. Listen. And in that listening, let yourself drift. Let the boundaries of the story dissolve, the way the boundaries of the shore dissolve where the water meets the sand. Not abruptly, not with a sharp line, but gradually, softly, in a zone of intermingling where one thing becomes another, and neither is quite itself. You are the library now. No, the building. No, the scrolls, but the space between them. The silence that held them together. the emptiness that made them meaningful. You are the pause between the words, the breath between the sentences, the hush that falls when a great truth has been spoken and the air is still vibrating with its resonance. You are the question that the library asked and that no one has ever fully answered. What does it mean to know? What does it mean to remember? What does it mean to carry? Within the fragile vessel of a human mind, the accumulated wisdom of 100 generations. These are not questions that need answers tonight. They are not questions that need answers at all. They are questions that tenderly, the way one holds a sleeping, how, or a kitchens, but night holds, out the stars, holds the star, say day, hold the stars, descend, a single bee, Eshen, a single bee. Hold them as sleep holds you now, in its vast and tender embrace, carrying you gently, inexorably, toward the shore of morning. There is one more thing. In the great catalogue of Callimachus, the Pinax, that monumental index of all the knowledge in the library, there must have been, somewhere, an entry for itself, a listing that said, in effect, this is the catalogue, this is the map of everything we know, and this, too, is part of what we know. A map that includes itself, a story that tells its own story, a dream that knows it is dreaming. This is the deepest mystery of the library. No, what it contained, but the fact that it contained itself, that it was in some profound and paradoxical sense. Both the mirror and the thing reflected, both the question and the answer, both the flame and the darkness against which the flame was visible. And we, tonight, have done the same thing. We have told the story of the library, and in doing so we have become parts of the library's story. We have added our voice to the chorus of voices that have spoken of this place across the centuries. Historians and poets, scholars and dreamers, the credulous and the skeptical, the mourners and the celebrants, we have taken our place in the long procession of those who have stood before the mystery of the library and tried, in their own imperfect way, to say what it meant. And what did it mean? Perhaps nothing more, and nothing less, than this, that we are a species that remembers, that in a universe of forgetting, a universe where stars burn out and galaxies drift apart, and the very atoms of which we are made, will one day disperse into the void. We alone, among all the creatures of this planet, have found a way to hold on, to mark, to record, to say, this happened, this mattered. This was real. The Library of Alexandria was the greatest expression of this impulse that the ancient world ever knew. And its loss is the greatest reminder we have ever received, that the impulse, however powerful, is not invincible. That memory can be destroyed, that knowledge can be lost, that the thread can be cut. But the thread can also be retied, the flame can be relit, the story can be told again, and as long as there are voices to tell it, and ears to hear it, and minds to hold it, and hearts to feel it, the Library of Alexandria will never truly be lost. It will be here, in this story, in this silence, in this moment between waking and sleep, always here, always whispering, always waiting to be found. Sleep, now, sleep, and let the ancient silence hold you. Sleep, and let the whisper of the library become the rhythm of your breath. Sleep, and let the starlight carry you to a shore you have never visited, but that you have always in some deep and secret chamber of your soul remembered. The library is dreaming. You are its dream, and in the morning, when you wake, you will carry something with you. A fragment, a shadow, a gleam of golden light. That will remind you, if only for a moment, of the place where all stories began, the place where the whispers gathered, the place where the silence spoke, the place where the starlight fell through the windows of a building that no longer exists, and illuminated the faces of scholars who are no longer with us, and touched the surface of scrolls that have long since turned to dust, but whose words, whose beautiful, irreplaceable, eternal words are still traveling through time, still searching for a mind that will receive them, still hoping to be heard. Still whispering, still whispering, still.